All right, everybody. Well, we're back on the blog this week with a new to me author, and maybe you know Tim, maybe you don't, but this is Tim Bishop. Hi, Tim.
Hi, glad to be here.
Glad to have you on the blog this week, and I'm interested to hear more about you since we've not met before, and I don't really know too much about you except for our little bit of conversation before we started recording this. So I'm excited to learn more about you. So let's go ahead and kick off, and you tell us about you and your family, what you want everybody out there to know about Tim Bishop.
Well, I'm a maniac and literally the state of Maine. So hopefully not the other version. Lived there for 50 years of my life, attended the state university and worked in corporate finance for many, many years. And in 2010, yeah, I left that occupation. I also left my single life, which I've been single my whole life at that point. And I also left the state of Maine. So some big changes occurred back in 2010. I married Debbie. Debbie is also my age. We're 15 days apart. She lived in Massachusetts at the time, so I ended up moving down to Massachusetts and began life there, but we didn't really begin life in earnest until we went on a long distance bicycle ride across the US. We both wanted to do something like that, but really hadn't had the opportunity. And it was so awesome that we decided to do it a few more times. And so by 2014, Debbie and I had bicycled over 10,000 miles across the United States.
Wow.
And what to tell about
it. That's so interesting to me. So my husband and I have bikes, and we've gone just locally to different places and ridden. And we've talked about like trying to go and do something like, I love waterfalls, but to take our bikes and travel around maybe Virginia and hit all of the waterfalls on the way or something. I'm curious, how long can you actually sit on a bike seat and ride before you have to stop?
Well, you can sit on it all day long, but it doesn't necessarily feel great. You probably hit the one single thing that bothers me most about all of the bicycle riding is the older you get, the harder it is too.
Yeah.
The harder the seat is.
Yes.
And it's but there are provisions for that in terms of padding and we use cream on our rear ends so that you don't get saddle sores and whatnot, because that can really, and we had to learn that by experience the hard way, because on our first tour we ran into some problems with saddle sores, and they can basically end your travel adventure pretty quickly.
So how long did it take you to complete a journey from start to finish?
Our first tour went from Oregon to Maine. We had probably 400 miles knocked out of that by people that shuttled us, because Debbie's a school teacher and she needed to be back by September 1st to get into the classroom. So it took 63 days from start to finish, and we had, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 rest days in that batch. We averaged I think it was 60 some miles a day of riding. And it's not, it sounds hard, but when you start out, like the first couple of weeks, you kind of get yourself into shape, and you're not going fast at all. And you're not, I mean, these are touring bikes, they're fully loaded. We each had 4 panniers and a handlebar bag each. So we took everything we needed for the trip with us. And once we were out there for a couple of weeks and we got through the saddle sore issue, then it was easy, really. It was just enjoying the day. You're on your bike all day long, just stopping for breaks or to look at scenery or to eat lunch, whatever. And Debbie's actually more adventuresome than I am. And she was like, one day after we'd stopped, she went back to school. She said, "Oh, I love to be on my bicycle. When do we go again?" That type thing.
Where do you sleep?
We took a tent with us and sleeping bags and hoped that we wouldn't have to use them a lot, but we had that. And sometimes you get stuck. You might need to stay in a campground, or one time it was along the side of the road on somebody's property that didn't know we were there. It was getting pretty dark.
Talk about adventure.
So it's, yeah, and we do it by the seat of the pants, really, because a lot of people plan their tours right out by stop, and we don't do that. We do have maps published by Adventure Cycling Association. They're an advocate for bicycle touring in the US. And they publish these turn-by-turn maps that show all of the kind of the facilities, resources around you. So motels, campgrounds, police stations, libraries, things like that, restaurants upcoming. So we have plenty of resources. We knew where the motels were going to be on our next day's ride, but until you get into the day, you're not sure really what the day's going to look like, what's going to happen, whether you have a breakdown or you want to spend more time stopping at some place, or you just never know, really.
Yeah. Well, that is fascinating to me. And I know some people watching may be saying, okay, I thought this was about books and writing. Why are we talking about cycling? Well, I'm asking all these questions because your adventure relates to your book, right, that we're going to talk about. So I think the background of it can help lay some foundation there for us too.
And actually, the inspiration behind the book came from an encounter we had with a guy on one of our bike trips. It was the high desert. Yeah, the high desert in Oregon. And this guy came into a restaurant, short guy, he's probably 60 years old. He was on a recumbent bicycle, and he'd come all the way from LA. And he just was spouting off about the people down at the campground the night before, tried to convert him. And here, Debbie and I were on this particular tour we were on. It was actually a fundraising tour for the Hope Line. And we used to be Hope coaches on the Hope Line, this internet chat basically for young people in crisis. So here we are on this tour trying to raise funds for a ministry. And this guy comes in talking about how hypocritical Christians are, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, man.
In the end, I think I asked him at one point, what if what they told you is true? And it wasn't very well received. And when we left that restaurant, kind of shaking our heads, we wondered what happened to this guy. We wondered what happened to him to make him the way he was. Why was he so angry? And what happened to him as he continued his bicycle ride across America, trying to dodge dogs, bears, tractor trailers, whatever, bad weather. So the persistent road answers those questions. This man became Doug Zimmer in the persistent road.
Okay. So I have a question. You worked in finance for many years. You're into cycling, taking these road trips. What in the world possessed you to then write a book? Is this something that you wanted to do for a while, or was this just random out of the blue? Oh, God wants me to write a book about this.
When I left corporate finance, I really felt God had something else for me. And one of the things on my radar was writing. Another thing was this involvement with the Hope Line. And Debbie and I actually wrote a couple books before this novel. One of them was kind of the story of how God brought us together, and then our first journey across the country. It's called Two or Better. And then after a third trip and 10,000 miles, we had so many God moments from the road. Yeah. It would have been derelict not to share those experiences. And we wrote a devotional called Wheels of Wisdom, Life Lessons for the Restless Spirit. And that includes 52 moments from our first 3 bicycle trips that taught a life lesson, could have been a spiritual truth or a practical piece of wisdom, and kind of formed it into a combination of a little bit of a travel log, but more so of a devotional for readers. So I also put together a business niche book. One of the things I used to do in my former life was trade heating oil futures and options. I worked for a heating oil distributor, and we also had a lot of real estate. So there was this concept of hedging risk is something I learned from the ground up. So I wrote a book called Hedging Demystified. And so as I went into writing the novel, I had these experiences already behind me. And I had a short story called Escape from Hell's Canyon. And it was kind of the middle part of the Persistent Road. And I said, what am I going to do with this? I put it in a contest that didn't place. I ran it by some editors. I said, what, do I have anything here? And they all came back and said, yeah, you ought to expand this and make it into a novel. Okay. Well, that was a learning experience. So writing a novel is more challenging than writing a little business book or a nonfiction book, at least in my experience. But it's also helped me, I think, grow as a writer as well.
Definitely. I told you this before we started recording. I had no idea what was involved in writing a novel in 2018 when I said, oh, I think I'm going to write a book and try to get published. I just laugh about it now, like, oh gosh, I had no clue what I was doing. And so much learning. So many things you have to know about writing a novel. So let's talk about your novel a little bit. So we know that it was kind of inspired by your cycling trips, right? What about the setting of the novel? Is it something that is like cross country? Is it in a specific location? Tell us a little about that.
Well, the guy that inspired it, this angry man that we met in Oregon, he was from LA. So that's where my novel starts.
Okay.
So he ends up, the premise here is that he loses everything he once held dear, and he's just depressed and suicidal. He doesn't know whether he wants to go on living. And he always wanted to do some type of adventure. And his wife, who was now parted, had urged him to do something. So he finally convinces himself to do this. So he rides up the California coast, Pacific Coast Highway 1. And then he gets up into Oregon and he meets a bunch of other bicycle travelers who they're going across the country on the Transamerica Trail. He says, the Transamerica Trail? He knows that trail. It's a bicycle trail across the United States. And he thought he might want to do that someday. Well, he's going to try it, even though he's running out of money. He doesn't know. He's got a gun on board, and he's going to end his depression one way or the other. But why not give this a try? So he ends up going across Oregon, up into Idaho, and don't want to give too much away, but that's kind of the premise is he's heading east across America.
Okay, so as far as researching for this novel, are you pulling pretty much from your experience in your travels, or is there other research that you had to do for this book?
It is both. I definitely am writing from what I know here in terms of what you experience on a bicycle travel and bicycle tour or journey for him. And I know that not just how you do it and what it's like, but I know many of the roads that he's been on and many of the sites. And in many respects, the reader is going to get a vicarious adventure here in addition to a lot of other goodies that aren't setting based. So I knew that those elements. I also have this coaching background. Right now, Surgeon General came out a few months ago. Loneliness is an epidemic in America. I'm seeing that in spades when I go talk to people online. And certainly my protagonist is dealing with those types of issues. So I'm very familiar with kind of the mindset of people who wrestle with those issues and how to urge them forward from a faith-based perspective. And but the other elements, this book also touches on, it's got some adventuresome plot details. I had 3 law enforcement people. A couple of them are former state troopers, had been in detective work. I have a couple people on helicopter rescue. And I had an insurance person I had to talk to. Even had to read some journaling that other bicycle travelers had done in California, because Debbie and I had not been there. And even contacted somebody in San Francisco that worked for some city administration. What's it like to bicycle across the Golden Gate Bridge? Hmm. So yeah, a lot of course, a lot of work on the internet as well, but so it's half and half, I'd say.
So you mentioned being faith-based, and obviously my blog is for Christian authors and Christian readers. So how do you go about incorporating Christ and hope and biblical principles into the book?
I have some characters in the book that have strong faith. And one of them, he comes into play later in the book, but he's a pastor who has a lot of counseling experience. Doug Zimmer's wife was a strong believer, though he wanted nothing to do with it. Mm-hmm. He meets travelers along the way, one in particular, Lauren Baumgartner, who just has a vibrant faith to her. And there's elements in this book of the gospel. I mean, it's very strong gospel appeal. Mm-hmm. Some might argue it's too much, but it's what I felt God was leading me to do with this story.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to be true to that first and foremost.
Yeah. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways to incorporate it, and it's exciting to see how, as you write, just how that comes about organically. Mm-hmm. When life deals us blows, we live long enough, we're going to encounter problems. And I think those types of events, whether they're in a story or in somebody's real life, really force a person to kind of look at themselves and to consider things that are a little deeper than surface things and things eternal.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a favorite quote from The Persistent Road you'd like to share with us?
The one that kind of sums up the book pretty well: he's going to pursue you until you either surrender to his will or cast him away. Hmm. That was the pastor just sharing with this guy who's struggling with life. There's another one that, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say that quote alone shows us a peek into the spiritual aspect of the book that we'll have access to when we read it. And I am like, I think a lot of Christian readers out there, I like a deep spiritual read. That's one reason I read Christian fiction. I want to be spiritually challenged.
There's another one that it touches me for some reason. I mean, you and I shared earlier about self-editing our novels. Yeah. And how many times we've been through those. And almost every time I came to this, I'd tear up. And I'm not normally a guy that cries. I think, wow, what? But there's a character, this Lauren Baumgartner. She has a musical instrument with her. It's a very unusual thing you would take on a bicycle on a trip. Mm-hmm. And she plays it for just a group of 3 other people at a very kind of intense time in this story. And the quote that ends the chapter, it just kind of sums up what had happened. It's a telling phrase, but it's a transitional comment, and it ties it up. A dazzling moment had been captured for posterity, even if remembered only by 4 individuals whom fate had united for a yet unknown purpose. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of intrigue to it, and but it's it's hard to pull it out of context.
Yeah. So there's 4 individuals whose lives are intersecting in the story. I like that.
Right. Yeah.
So when a person reads this book, when they get to the end and they close that cover, what are you hoping that they are going to walk away with?
Well, first, I want them to enjoy the book. I want it to be captivating to them, so they will read through to the end. And the other thing is, for Christians, people aren't just born angry. They're born with a sin nature, but they're not born angry. So we need to be sensitive to what's going on in people's lives when we share with them, we try to minister to them. And I think that's one thing that comes through some of the people that had read this. Even one of the endorsers, he basically said, I'm going to be more thoughtful of how I share Christ in the future. So just an awareness of, what's going on in other people's lives. What's God doing? Try, should I be joining him in what he's doing in this person's life?
Right.
And of course, there is always hope. That's the bedrock theme here. That's what I try to be about when I do coaching online. And that's what our other material has been about, other than the business book. And that's, the hope that ultimately is found in Jesus, personal relationship with God through Jesus.
Amen. And that's all of what my blog is about and what my writing is about. Hope-filled fiction. Like, I'm writing about real hard things like suicide and mental illness and addictions and, lots of, things like that, pornography, abortion, all these things, but hope in the midst of it all, because there's a lot of pain out there. And like you said, there's people, I don't know, I think, especially since COVID, there's been so much more hopelessness and isolation and loneliness and confusion and just so many things that people are struggling with. And to have a fiction story touch on some of those things and bring people hope and entertain them at the same time is very compelling to me. So thank you for being one of those people who's putting a book out there to help fill that gap and meet that need for people.
Yeah, it actually has been a privilege to do it. It's neat when you feel like, it's, how this works. It's hard.
Yes.
It's really hard. This is indie published. But ultimately, I feel good about what I've done, and that this is what God wanted me to do.
Yeah.
And I've given it my best shot, and hey, he can do with it how he sees. And so I feel good about that part of it, definitely.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the blog this week and sharing with us about the book. And I wish you great success with this and your future endeavors. I'm sure there's another book that you're working on. Is it a sequel to this or something totally separate?
It is a sequel.
Okay.
I mean, there's there's good closure to this book, but there's enough rope left over that I can go a little further on the journey.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you. And hope everybody who's watching will share this on your social media, help spread the word so Tim can sell more books and reach people with this message of the gospel. And be sure you comment so that you have a chance to win a copy of Tim's book. Hopefully he's piqued your interest enough for you to want to read it. So thanks again, Tim, and I'll be seeing you around online.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.